in the meantime, we've got another segment coming up. We're going to go back over the talk studio. Our call-in line is 845-331-9255. Dial it, don't file it. You can get a hold of Al, Fred. Well, Al's left, but Fred and Cynthia, so let's go back over there. Good morning.
Nice to meet you.
Keith.
Okay, here we are. We're back again, and this is the last segment of our Taste of the Town of Ulster and our Sip of the City of Kingston. The Sip had to leave. He has to go to work.
Our champagne toast.
Yes, right. He's a little flat, though.
But you're so fresh. Okay,
That's because I love Albert.
I know, but people think you.
And we have two more guests here this morning, and we're on live. You can go on your computer and watch us live, so you can see what people are looking at as you talk.
Yay! Early in the morning. It's great.
So we're going to have these two gentlemen introduce themselves and tell us why they're here.
Well, I'm Bruce Whistance. I'm the Public Information Officer of the Overlook Mountain Amateur Radio Club in the area.
Your microphone closer to you. There you go.
And we're here today to talk about amateur radio activities in the county. And we have also my boss, the emergency coordinator. He's the team leader of the emergency communications mission that Overlook Mountain Amateur Radio Club sponsors.
Yeah, my name is Keith Tilley, and I am the emergency coordinator for the Amateur Radio Emergency Service. And we have a team of about 25 licensed amateur radio operators, and it's our job to be prepared to provide communications in the event of an emergency. When traditional standard communications fails, we go in with amateur radio stations and set up at places like emergency shelters or town offices, stuff like that, and fill the gap where communication is no longer available.
Oh, so you would probably be working with the first lieutenant with the preparedness corps out of the state of New York, for the state of New York.
Yeah, I heard a piece of the last segment.
Yeah.
They certainly complement each
primarily,
other.
we work with a couple of agencies. One is the County Department of Emergency Management. They can dispatch us if there's areas of public services necessary. Right. And also we work with the Red Cross. Like you mentioned that the Red Cross might set up a shelter in the Rosendale Rec Center. The Red Cross has a couple of dozen designated shelters in the event of emergency, and they may open one or they may open several. And the Red Cross has a small amateur radio contingent, but if they get overloaded, they would call on us, and we would set up a radio station in each shelter. They've got an amateur radio station in their chapter house in Poughkeepsie, and we could allow them to communicate with each other.
So this is really quite a network that's around here. I never realized you have 25 operators in the county.
Yep.
That are they strategically located throughout the county?
Well, they're all volunteers, but
Right.
But we have plans in place. In the event that we needed to dispatch them, we could send them all over the county. We depend on a couple of things. One is we depend on each volunteer to have his own equipment, his or her own equipment, and we do. One of the challenges we face is the geography of the county. There's some places where radio communication is just tough.
Right.
Our least favorite area is Phoenicia and Shandaken.
Right.
Because they can talk to each other, but nobody else in the universe. So one of the challenges we have...
Cell phones aren't great up there either.
Yeah, they're not. We did a public service event. There was a race, a marathon race that ended in Phoenicia, and we had to set up communications along the race course, and we discovered that cell phone service is sketchy, internet service is iffy, and radio communication is just about impossible. But we did find a way. We found a way to connect Phoenicia with the rest of the world, and they learned there's a world out there outside Phoenicia, and we that's one of the challenges that we face. If we had to put a shelter in Phoenicia and get it to communicate with Poughkeepsie, it wouldn't be as simple as it sounds.
Yeah, we learned that the hard way. We were delivering a wedding cake, and our navigation system said you have arrived, and it was a mountain on my left and not grass in front of me, and there was no home.
There was no building there.
There was nothing there. So, and my cell phone didn't work. That's how we found out that the cell phone didn't. To find out where am I going, and luckily there was a gentleman at home, and he had a landline, and he was kind enough to let me use it. But he also knew that the road continued, that the grass didn't mean that the road was finished.
So we ended
had
up
to
going down
drive
this dirt road
up this
to deliver. We finally found a house at the end of this dirt road about 2 miles further in. That's
Yeah.
where the
Oh,
wedding
my
cake went.
goodness.
It was unbelievable.
Keith,
It was
Keith, I
very
understand you have a
interesting.
course
So
coming up.
We are very familiar with the difficulty in communication
Yes,
sometimes.
yes.
So is that where you have to start? Is that what you look for first, is how you're going to communicate with other people in an area? Is that the most important? I would think that would be one of the most important things.
It is. You know, we look at the places that are most likely to have shelters set up or to need communications, and we have practices where we put people in stations around there and see how it works. We've had exercises that cover most of the county. We're aware where the difficult spots are, where the easy spots are, and where we have a difficult spot, we try different techniques to try to find a way to connect them. Phoenicia is one because of the geography. Ellenville is another one because of where it is. We have what we call a repeater. Basically, it's an amateur radio station in a really high place that receives your signal and retransmits it really loud. So we have a couple of repeaters around the county. So if we can't get in with a standard handheld radio, we can use the repeater to make it more likely that we can establish communication with people in one of those areas.
How does one become an amateur radio person?
I was trying to chime in
It's
on
not
that,
as
but
hard
you
as it
can't hear me
sounds.
there. Can you get
The FCC, the Federal Communication Commission, requires amateur radio operators to have a license. And in order to get that license, you've got to pass a test. It's a 35-question multiple choice test. And the questions and answers are all published. There's a question pool of about
Can you hear me
450
now?
questions. You'll get 35 of them on your test. So you can self-study by looking at all the questions, and there's literature available online, and you can buy books and study. The Overlook Mountain Amateur Radio Club also offers classes. If you like a classroom experience, we have classes where we teach you what you need to know to pass that exam. In fact, we have a class coming up starting on September 22nd at Family of Woodstock in Kingston, right up the road.
Yeah, I've been trying to chime in about it. I think I'm going to try and sign up this time.
Oh, good for you. Now,
I just turned
you
it up
said
because it wasn't-
a person needs their own equipment. Bruce, what,
Yeah, what
what
kind of equipment?
do you need?
Well, that's a really there's a vast array of answers to that question. One of the reasons that amateur radio operators are so useful in emergencies is that you don't really know what you're in for, and amateur radio operators are experienced in using a lot of different kinds of radios, and there's a great diversity. We have handheld transceivers which we can use locally and with the repeaters, as Keith said. We also have equipment that'll operate throughout the world on the right frequencies.
Really?
What we call HF, for high frequency. It reflects off the ionosphere and bounces down. So the value to the community, whether it be a humanitarian organization or a government agency, is the ability of amateur radio operators to respond with a kind of a creative solution to a particular communications need. And also we are quite experienced with operating under very difficult conditions, and we are able to relay through stations that are intermediate to get from one point to another point that may not be able to communicate with each other. So we have protocols that we've developed over 100 years in the amateur radio community to relay messages. And there are networks, and Keith is a network control operator in the Hudson Valley to take messages and pass them on. So there are actually exercises that are regularly held to practice passing messages through networks. So you can go from any point on the Earth to any other point on the Earth through these intermediate nodes. So the simple question, the answer to your question is for $30 today, you can get started with a radio to get involved in ham radio, and you can use the repeaters that organizations like Overlook Mountain Amateur Radio Club provide to the amateur radio community to be able to speak over a wider area with that small little $30 radio. Now that's the entry price, right? You can spend a lot more for.
Oh, I'm sure thousands of dollars.
And there are really feature-rich radios that operate not just voice, and we still use Morse code from time to time for a challenge or if it's absolutely necessary. But it's not required any longer to to be proficient in Morse code to have a license. But there are also digital modes where you can connect your computer through amateur radio networks, completely independent of the internet.
Wow.
And there's a lot of exciting new things that can be done with ham radio these days, if you have the right equipment.
So when I mentioned earlier about when I was in Antarctica and we used to talk to a ham operator in New Zealand, he could actually take my message and bounce it back and forth and get all the way up here to Ulster County?
Yes, yes. Again, depending on the equipment and the atmospheric conditions, you might be able to do it directly. More likely, I'd talk to a station somewhere else, and they'd go somewhere else, and they could relay it that way. Modern radio equipment and our current understanding of how it works makes it relatively simple to talk to anybody anywhere in the world. You just have to know when they're going to be on the radio and what frequency they're going to be on. So with a little planning, worldwide communication really isn't that difficult.
So do you have these delays, though, transmitting from one station to the next?
Not really noticeable, because radio waves travel at the speed of light.
Right.
So you might be a fraction of a second delayed, but nothing more than that. One interesting phenomenon is if I were to talk to somebody halfway around the world, the radio wave might travel different paths.
Right.
So you might hear an echo as the signal arrives from a couple of different places. That's kind of interesting to hear.
We have a call.
We have a caller. So.
Oh, okay.
Good morning, caller.
You're on the air.
Hey, good morning. This is Andy Champduran. How you guys doing today?
Real good, thanks.
Hey, listen, I wanted to say amateur radio folks did a great service for our family. Back in 1980, when phone calls were the most expensive thing, I went to Alaska for a while with a buddy of mine, and I was able to talk to my parents back in Iowa with amateur radio hookups. My family had friends in Iowa that were ham operators, and we were able to hook up with an Air Force dude in Anchorage. And it was just great. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to afford the phone calls.
Wow.
Yeah, and amateur radio has a history back before cell phones were ubiquitous, working with the military to work with people to enable communication with people in far-off lands where there may not be any other communications infrastructure available. The military is concerned with running the business of the military, but there were amateur radio operators to do more personal things before it became easy to do it on their own. And it wasn't that long ago. 1980, as I recall, there were no cell phones, or very few. Actually, my first cell phone in the 80s was about the size of a small suitcase, and I wouldn't want to lug that to Alaska.
And it was a fortune.
Oh, yes, very expensive.
There were folks all over Alaska who lived in very remote areas, and they were able to communicate with the lower 48 and other folks across in out in the wilderness, just out in the bushes. They said, with radio operators, amateur radio operators.
Yeah, wow.
So thank you very much for the service that you guys performed for us all over.
Well, thank you. Thank you for calling. Have a nice day. Thank you.
Don't forget, it's primary day today, so get out and vote.
Yes. We made the announcement at the top of the hour. We will do it again before the end of the
All
hour.
right.
You'll
Thanks
vote
a
again?
lot. I
No,
appreciate
make
it.
the announcement. Thank you, sir.
And
Have a nice day.
tomorrow's also our 9/11 memorial service in the town of Ulster. So we, at 10 o'clock down at Post Park.
Yeah, actually, amateur radio operators were active on the 9/11 disaster because a lot of
the radios didn't work.
Right, the
with
cellular communication
with the
equipment was on
firemen
the
and
towers.
the policemen, I guess, had trouble, both of them, with their radios.
One of the things that a lot of people learn from that is that cell phones and the internet and a lot of the social media and the communications we use today are very dependent on infrastructure existing. One building, granted it was a very important building, but one building had all the antennas and all the infrastructure for the cell networks down there and a lot of the other communication facilities. When that building became unavailable, everything failed. Right. And so one of the beauties of amateur radio is it can work with no support anywhere. We don't need the internet. We don't need a cell network. We don't even need commercial power. We can run off of batteries. So in a true emergency situation, it may be the only communication vehicle available, even in downtown Manhattan, where you'd think it was totally out of place.
Do you have any idea how many operators, radio operators, amateur radio operators worked in that situation?
Oh, there were hundreds.
Hundreds?
In New York
We
City.
never heard that. I mean, they should have really publicized that.
We try, but a lot of people have the misconception that amateur radio was old news, that nobody uses it anymore. Now we have cell phones and we have other alternatives.
Well,
But
that's
amateur
good to
radio,
know.
it's useful all the time, but it's especially useful when nothing else is available.
Right.
Then you realize how dependent you are
how
on
important
this
you
stuff
are.
working.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very good. Do you have any women that are ham radio operators?
Absolutely.
Do you really? A lot?
I probably not as many
As you should.
As we should. But we are trying to encourage diversity, and there are. I don't know what statistics are on the number of women versus men.
It's actually increasing because a generation or two ago, girls in school weren't encouraged to study science. Now that's not true anymore, and we're getting more girls and women getting interested in amateur radio. It's still maybe 10 to 12% of the total, but we're working on it.
Is there an age limit that a young person can get interested or begin this?
No minimum and no maximum.
Oh, okay.
The youngest student I've ever had in one of my classes was 9.
Really?
Now, her grandfather is a serious ham, and he helped a lot, but I had a 9-year-old pass the exam.
Wow, that's excellent.
I have a granddaughter who's now 10. She's been bugging me for years. And we've talked about it from time to time, but if you can comprehend the words in the test and answer them correctly, at any age you can get a license.
That's good to know. I didn't realize that either. That's good. I'll have to think about
And you
it.
actually run classes and, to train people.
Yeah, you can self-study and do it on your own, but if you prefer a class, a lot of clubs offer classes. We have one that we're just going to start in a couple of weeks for Family of Woodstock. Their operations in an emergency depend on communication, and they want to get some of their folks trained as amateur radio operators. They have 4 locations around the county, and they want to be able to communicate with each other.
Right.
So they asked us to do a class that we're starting in a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
And if that's
And
open to the public too.
It is open to the public.
And where do you do this class? Whereabouts
Well,
do you...
sometimes we give it in the Woodstock Rescue Squad building, and this one is being given in Kingston. That's
Okay, do you have a phone number that people could call in for,
Sure, people could call me. The number is 687-9951. That's my home number. And the class is alternating, I think, Tuesdays and Thursdays, starting on September 22nd. And the class is going to be in Kingston. If you have an organization that wants training, we can bring the class on the road. We also offer them a couple times a year and open them to the general public. And we get a pretty good reception. We get a lot of folks coming. So there is an interest in amateur radio, particularly around emergency communications nowadays.
Yeah,
That
I can
is
tell
so
you,
important.
we're really lucky to have Keith as an instructor. He's a professional instructor, and when he gives these courses, a lot of the experienced amateurs like to come and sit in because he is just so entertaining when he gives these courses.
Well, that's very important.
Well, that's
so
good. That's great.
Good. That's
Yes.
good. Nothing worse than having to sit through a class and being bored to death. And I've been through many of those.
Yeah, my first exposure to electronics in high school wasn't fun. And I realized, how much joy can you get out of an electron? But we find a way. and
very
there are
true.
3 levels of amateur license, and the first one isn't really technical. There's some science you've got to know, but it's also a lot of procedures and regulations and stuff. As you
and
get
keeping safe.
and keeping safe, yes. As you get to the 2nd and 3rd level, it's a lot more technical. But you don't need to have a science background or a communications background to get that first license. It really is an entry into the world of amateur
Now,
radio.
In a disaster as 9/11, were these very experienced, or were they just basic Bob licensed ham radio operators?
All experience
All-
levels.
all
I mean, there were a lot
levels?
of jobs to do. There were people that we had to put out in the field just to report what was going on. There were other folks that did relays, as Bruce was talking about, or ran networks where dozens of people got in and shared information. Some were stationed outside of the city, because sometimes the best place to be is a little bit out of the affected area where you've got utilities. So there were a lot of stations in Westchester and Putnam and on the island that all worked to try to get all this information passed back and forth. So with very little experience, there's a thing you can do. There's a contribution you can make
That's
to an
great.
emergency operation.
And I've had 3 experiences just getting on my radio and unexpectedly being involved in a relatively serious emergency. So there's things that you can do from your home. If you're on the right frequency at the right time, you might be able to help somebody. If you're out traveling, you might just be the person that is necessary to solve some problems in an emergency.
So when you travel, do you take all your equipment with you? I mean,
I usually just bring a HT, and I have a unit in my car, a mobile unit, and the Motor Vehicle Bureau provides amateur radio plates so that if
so people will know that.
yeah,
you're
if a
there.
law enforcement officer needs to communicate, and actually we've been able to communicate on behalf of law enforcement when their radios were not able to get through. But one time when I was out visiting my my wife's family out in Tornado Alley there, that they were expecting a tornado, and one of the things we do in amateur radio is we participate in the Skywarn program. So we go through training with the National Weather Service in the spring and fall for severe weather, and we have a net in the morning that takes the readings and provides them for meteorological models and hydrologic models to predict flooding and that sort of thing. So I was trained on by Skywarn, and I called in on the local frequency that I was a Skywarn spotter, and I was looking for a tornado. It ended up that the sheriff's department lost their antenna in the tornado, and they were no longer able to communicate with the emergency management office. But I was on a hill with my little radio, so I was relaying messages from the sheriff's department to the emergency management office, and I didn't even know where these places were that I was talking about. I was just from out of town, but we're trained and experienced to just handle messages in a very matter-of-fact way without distorting the message, and so luckily I kind of plugged into my amateur radio experience. And when I was done, I said, well, what would you have done if I wasn't in town? And they said, well, we'll have to talk about that.
So they really had no plan in
So-
place.
They hadn't
something-
plando for the tornado blowing the antenna off the
antenna,
sheriff's department. No.
Which,
But it happened that one of the
It's
deputies
life.
was a radio amateur, and he had his handheld
and that's
radio.
how you were able to.
So I was talking with him,
manage it. Wow.
and so things like that can happen when you're in amateur radio. An adventure is likely
Right
to pop
out
up
there.
at any time.
Yeah. But now you do a lot of fun things too, besides just
Absolutely,
because
absolutely.
you have to have that side of it as well, which
Amateur
is
radio is a lot of
which is
fun.
why people probably get into it originally, is to have fun.
Yeah, I mean, there's 3 reasons most people get involved. One is the emergency communications. A second is just to be able to talk. You know, isn't it great to be able to talk to somebody anywhere in the world?
Anywhere in the world.
Anywhere in the world.
And you make new friends that way.
Absolutely. Yep. I mean, you may have family members or friends that you want to stay in touch with, or if you read about something going on someplace in the world, you can talk to somebody in Afghanistan.
Wow.
You know, find out what's really going on over there, for example. And the third reason people get involved is the science of it. They're fascinated by electronics and how radios work. And one thing that a lot of hams like to do is try to make their radio a little more efficient or a little more powerful. What if I tinker with that? So there are a lot of fun parts of the hobby. It's considered a hobby and a service. And if it weren't fun, a lot of people probably wouldn't do it.
One of the things about amateur radio, it's kind of a community of people that work together to figure out how to solve problems and do things, make things that aren't necessarily available commercially,
Yeah.
that do-it-yourself kinds of things.
Okay, so we're gonna have to go. The end of the program is coming up. So you're from the Overlook Mountain Amateur Radio Club, and Keith, you're doing a clinic on September 22nd in Kingston, and your number is 687-9951.
That's right.
Anybody interested?
Yep.
Give you a call.
And Bruce, thank you so much.
Well, we
Nice
want to thank you
meeting
for coming
Thank you
in.
for coming
Thank
in.
you for having me.
Don't forget, it's primary
And
day.
Please come back again.
Don't forget,
You
it's
bet.
primary day.
Today's primary day. Voting is from noontime to 9 this evening.
And library vote day at the Town of Ulster Library
From 2 o'clock to
2 to
8:30.
8. Thank
And
you.
tomorrow is the 9/11
9/11
memorial
ceremony.
service in the Town of Ulster at Post Park at 10 o'clock. We want to thank everyone out there in KCR land for listening this morning, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great week.